Welcome to Post Whatever with Ken Nishikawa. Today, I'd like to talk about music, art, culture, and, because apparently we can't help ourselves, a bit of economics. Yes, the dirty E word. 2 cities, 1 decade. London and Tokyo in the 1990s. The 90s were, in my humble opinion, a rather exceptional decade. They began with the end of the Cold War, which some historians call World War III. And as soon as the decade ended, 9/11 occurred and triggered the massive ongoing conflict between the Christian world and the Islamic world, which, again, some historians are already calling it World War IV. A war which, depressingly, shows no sign of calling it a day. Whilst there were horrific wars and genocides in Yugoslavia, Africa and many other parts of the world, and even in the UK, IRA was still active. As far as Japan, Western Europe, North America and the rest of the bits that most Western journalists consider worth covering are concerned, it was a period of relative stability and peace. Maybe I'm being embarrassingly naive and ignorant in saying this, but in retrospect, and from where I was standing, which was London, that's genuinely what the 90s looked like. I was in my 20s for most of the 90s and lived a good part of that decade in London. Yes, I am barely 60. It was the era of Cool Britannia, Britpop and the YBA, speaking of which, there is currently an exhibition called YBA Beyond, British Art in the 90s from the Tate Collection at the National Art Centre, Tokyo. It runs until the 11th of May, that is to say this coming Monday, which doesn't leave you a great deal of time. So, if you're partial to contemporary art, or simply enjoy standing in rooms looking thoughtful, I strongly recommend it. The epicenter of the YBA, the Young British Artists Movement, was a college in South London called Goldsmiths. My old bandmate and one of my closest chums studied musicology there, so I used to visit there quite often, occasionally sneaking into lectures as an uninvited guest student. For over a decade after the Second World War, the United States was the dominant force in the global cultural landscape. Their cultural hegemony was, however, seriously challenged in the 1960s by the British. The British invasion, led by the likes of the Beatles, quite literally changed the consciousness of young people around the world, including Japan, in fact, especially Japan. All of a sudden, London became the world centre of music, art, fashion, and many other things. The following decade, the 1970s, brought punk, which was also extraordinarily influential, not only musically but in its DIY spirit. It politicized a generation in some strange ways. That punk ethos may even be the distant ancestor of today's entrepreneurial culture, which is rather ironic given that punk set out to outthrow capitalism and instead ended up inspiring tech startups and helped create this world of complete disparity. British pop music remained dominant into the 1980s. New wave, new romantics, synth pop, all born in the UK and forming the backbone of what's sometimes called the Second British Invasion. Here's a fact that tends to surprise people. When most of us hear the phrase the British invasion, we tend to think of the Beatles and the Stones in the 60s. Which isn't entirely wrong, of course. And we assume that that was bigger in scale and more influential culturally. But in 1985, British acts achieved a record-breaking 13 #1 hits on the Billboard Hot 100, representing roughly 1/3 of all chart-topping songs that year. The highest proportion by non-American acts in the chart's history, exceeding even the peak of the original 1960s invasion. In other words, the British music industry at that point was not so much knocking on America's door as walking in right through the window. Things shifted somehow in the 90s. The decade began with Manchester and acid jazz. As a young musician living in London, I witnessed the rise of Britpop, trip-hop emerging from Bristol, and jungle mutating into drum and bass, and then there was the electronic music coming out of the Warp label. Aphex Twin, Square Pusher, artists who sounded as though they had invented the time machine and travelled 30 years into the future and brought back the music. The irony here is that 30 years on, their music from that period sounds positively more futuristic and innovative than the mainstream pop music today. It was an excessively stimulating time to be in London. Meanwhile, British film industry also enjoyed remarkable resurrection. Trainspotting, which made heroin addiction look oddly cinematic and it's just swept the world. London was leading internationally in contemporary art with Damien Hirst, Tracy Emin, Julian Opie, and countless others making the global conversation happen in South London warehouse spaces that smelt faintly of dump and ambition. But globally, and especially in the United States, sales of British music began to show sign of slowing in the 90s. Britpop, for example, with its guitar-driven sound and quintessentially English sensibility, was the dominant mode in the mid to late 90s British music. In the United States, however, following the grunge movement of the early 90s, the charts shifted decisively towards hip-hop, and guitar-based music somewhat declined. These two trajectories simply did not intersect. There was also another small matter: the accent. Previously, British acts, anyone from the Beatles to George Michael to Phil Collins to David Bowie, had sung in a sort of mid-Atlantic approximation of American English, sort of pseudo-black American English. Bowie in particular sounded like he'd grown up somewhere between Brixton and Kansas. Britpop bands largely refused this compromise or tradition and sung in their own authentic regional accents, which I personally respect and admire. However, they perhaps underestimated the degree of American conservatism when it comes to foreign vowels. On top of that, Britpop lyrics were dense with British culture references. Anything from class systems to London postcodes to English football clubs. Material that meant absolutely nothing to a teenager in Ohio. That said, and this is where Japan comes in, since most people here cannot tell the difference between the British and American accent, Britpop bands were enormously successful in Japan. In fact, the first time Oasis were properly mobbed by fans, scenes described as not unlike Beatlemania in 1964, was on their first tour of Japan in 1994. The boys played small clubs and were followed everywhere. It was chaos in the best possible sense. By around 2002, for the first time since the Beatles, weeks were passing with no British acts in the Billboard Top 100. Given the triumphant history of the British pop music and British rock music I've just outlined, that is a rather spectacular fall. And it all happened within the space of a decade or so. Maybe not so much since Brexit, though Brexit has certainly added its own special flavour of irrelevance. But before that, London and the United Kingdom were, financially speaking, more prosperous than ever in its history. And although the disposable income of the working class had been diminishing since the 90s, because that's how things usually work around the world, the rich were getting richer with their abominable passive income at such a pace that their overall numbers looked rather cheerful. So, financially, Britain was doing fine. Well, only numbers, but British economy seemed to be doing quite well. But culturally, it had become less significant to the outside world, particularly to America and maybe to a lesser degree, but increasingly to Japan, to my own personal disappointment. As a teenager growing up in Japan in the 80s, London and perhaps New York had this extraordinary halo around them. We all wanted to go there. We wanted to experience everything from there, the music, the fashion, the art, the general impression that something important was happening. Ask Japanese teenagers today what cities captivate them, and the answer is most likely Seoul, South Korea. And because hip-hop remains somewhat popular, the US still has some cultural currency with younger audiences. But London, Britain, they have lost their edge. Not so much to us older generation, but anyone under 30 in this country, they can't quite see what the fuss was about. Which is, I suppose, the point I'm trying to make here. I was extraordinarily fortunate to have been in London during what I consider to be the last decade in which it was considered by the outside world to be genuinely cool. Since then, London has become a city for investors and property developers, not for bohemians and artists. The artists are still there, I'm sure, but living in places they cannot afford. Tragic, really. Tokyo in the 90s was also fascinating, though in a slightly different key. I didn't spend the entire decade there, but long enough to observe and make my own assessment of its positioning globally at the time. The 90s was Japan's first lost decade. We are now onto the fourth lost decade. But here is something worth posing on. Just before the bubble burst, the trading volume of the Tokyo Stock Exchange exceeded that of Wall Street, and land prices were astronomical here. The famous example in the late 1980s, the land value of the Imperial Palace grounds alone was estimated to exceed that of the entire state of California. Or the Tokyo 23 wars theoretically could buy the entire continental United States. Today, I am not sure you could even sell all of Japan and buy California. I don't think so. So that was how Tokyo was 35 years ago or so, and I was in my early 20s and working in television and teaching English here and playing in the band. I earned enough to travel regularly to the UK, the US and Europe, and everywhere I went at the time was cheap compared to Tokyo. The only country I can remember where prices felt remotely comparable to Tokyo was Switzerland, which, as we all know, charges you for the air. The rent in London in the 90s was also cheaper than Tokyo. Well, cheaper for what you get. If you're a young person earning a decent salary in Tokyo today in 2026, traveling to the UK or the US is not impossible, but it is extremely costly. Accommodation and food can easily be double or triple Tokyo prices. The only Western European countries that I can think of where the cost of living today feels comparable to Japan are perhaps Spain and Portugal, and maybe possibly Italy, though I think Italy edges slightly ahead. How times change. At Japan's economic zenith in 1994, already some years after the bubble burst, technically, but before the full weight of the lost decades had set in, Japan's share of global GDP was approximately 18%, which amounted to roughly 71% of the US economy at the time. Considering that US population was more than double Japan's at the time, and that Japan's population represented only around 2.2% of humanity then, that is an almost incomprehensible concentration of economic output. For reference, Japan's share of global GDP at the peak was actually higher than China's share today, at least in nominal terms. Japan in 1994 was producing a larger slice of the world economy than the most populous nation on earth manages now. Well, I say most populous, actually I think India surpassed China as the most populous country in the world about 2 years ago, but still the second most populous. What is equally impressive, or perhaps depressing, depending on your disposition, is the subsequent fantastic fall. Japan's share of global GDP today stands at approximately measly 3.7%. That is roughly 1/5 of that it was 30 years ago. And before you say, oh, hang on a minute, that's because not Japan has fallen, but all the other countries have grown, and Japanese economy is mature. That's true, except that America's GDP dominance in the last 30 years pretty much stayed the same, roughly around 25%. So when you compare that to the state of Japan today, the fall, I must say, is spectacular. And some observers argue that this isn't actually a collapse, that Japan transitioned into an aggressive growth economy to what they call a mature quality of life nation, a high-functioning 3.7%, if you will. World-class infrastructure, social stability, cultural soft power that far outstrips its GDP percentage. The fall from 18% to 3.7% in this reading, therefore, isn't pure decline. It's the story of a nation reaching the end of growth before anyone else and providing a kind of cautionary roadmap for the rest of the developed world. I'm sure there's some truth in that, but it doesn't change the underlying observation that Tokyo, like London, is losing its gravitational pull on the global imagination. Like I said in the beginning of the show, I went to see YBA exhibition British Art in the 90s at the National Art Centre, Tokyo, recently, and that's actually what made me want to do this episode, especially before the exhibition ends. I was exposed to that whole scene 30 years ago, and 30 years ago it was all je ne sais quoi. Today it's a period piece, and maybe that's the saga of all contemporary art. After all, perhaps growth isn't everything. Maybe it's an overrated value. Perhaps Tokyo and London, both of which at different points in history held the title of the wealthiest city on the planet, are entering what you might call a post-prosperity wabi-sabi state. Wabi-sabi, for those uninitiated, is the Japanese aesthetic of finding beauty in impermanence, incompleteness, and graceful decay. The Japanese have a word for it, and the British also have a word for it. They call it character. And maybe, just maybe, that's not as bad as you think. And on that note, this has been Post Whatever. If you found any of that remotely useful or even mildly diverting, do consider liking and subscribing. I'm Ken Nishikawa. Until next time, stay pop and bubbly.